Hello everyone. You can see that I have the top half of the face of my teaching assistant with me. I have to take her to the doctor today because of her ears. Did you just...
Gaga.
Yes, Gaga. I want to help you guys go over the reading because the reading is tough. There is the word quixotic on page, I think 6 or 7. I forget off the top of my head right now. It's not like vocabulary like that. It's all over the place. But let's break this down. Let's make this a little bit simpler for you guys. I am specifically doing these slides with the notion of helping you to identify the author's main argument, intent, and how the author goes about proving those arguments. So those will be exceedingly helpful for you to answer some of those bolded questions on your roundtable prompts. Okay? Let's get into it. The Supreme Court and Judicial Review. I want to quickly recap what Judicial Review is. That main power that the Supreme Court uses, the thing that we use to define what a Supreme Court justice is. Judicial Review means that the courts, especially the Supreme Court, can check the actions of the President and Congress to make sure they follow the Constitution. If a law or action goes against the Constitution, the courts can strike it down. Right? It is because of Judicial Review that we have same-sex marriage. It is because of Judicial Review that we have desegregated schools. This Judicial Review power, it's because of Judicial Review that we have Miranda rights. It's because of Judicial Review that police officers have to say you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you to court of law, blah, blah, blah. That comes from Judicial Review. That comes from a Supreme Court case, right? So these things have a big role to play in how government officials do their jobs and how we as citizens live our lives, right? So it's very important for us to understand what a Supreme Court justice is and the types of maybe problems with the way that we do Supreme Court, right? Let's go to our initial problem and solution. So we're writing the Constitution, right? We're putting together what is a Supreme Court justice. We're writing Article 3, which gives us the federal judicial branch, right? When we do that, we want to make sure that those judges can make their own judgments, that they are not too dependent on the president, that they are not too dependent on Congress, that they can do their own stuff, right? We get this as a claim, as a set of 2 claims on page 1, right? JJ, you gotta go. That was extremely cute, but you gotta go. So the founders knew of the long struggle of their English ancestors to obtain a judiciary that, although appointed by the crown, was not subservient to either the executive or legislative branches of government. Right? The purpose of the good behavior and lifetime clauses, judges are judges for life and receive a reasonable salary, was to establish judges that were independent of the president. These are 2 claims that are on page 1. And it is from these claims that we get this broad interpretation. We gave the Supreme Court justices the job for life in order to give them independence from the president and Congress, from the president and our lawmaking bodies, right? How do we know that, though? We know how we know that. We know how we know that because it comes from the Declaration of Independence and it comes from records of the Federal Convention of 1787. The Declaration of Independence calls out King George III for making judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. So our initial problem is that British people, so the governmental institutions that controlled our colonists, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that set up our country, those people were calling out King George for controlling what judges could say and do, right? So there's a problem where if the king can take away your salary, you're going to do what the king tells you to do. We also have some of these ideas from the records of the Federal Convention of 1787. These records indicate that the founders intended the Good Behavior Clause and the Compensation Clause to provide a federal judiciary that would exercise independent judgment in deciding cases, free from the influence and control of the political branches of the federal government. So we have our claims, and those claims are proven from these excerpts from documents that come from primary sources. right? So this brings me, so aside from just emboldening this claim, this broad interpretation that we can use to help answer our questions, that we gave the Supreme Court justices the job for life in order to give them independence from the executive and legislative branches, we can arrive at that interpretation and feel comfortable about that interpretation because we were able to read the document and discern, we could decide which passages were claims and which passages were evidence that supports those claims. By being able to do that, analyzing that relationship is how we form our interpretations. So I want to give us some general guidance for how we identify claims. To identify a claim, look for an arguable statement that presents the main point or thesis of the argument. Ask yourself the question, how do you know or why? If the statement itself does not answer the question, how do you know, it's a claim. If the statement itself does not answer the question why, it's a claim. Let's go back to our claims. The founders knew of the long struggle of their English ancestors to obtain a judiciary that was not subservient to the executive or legislative branches. Well, how do you know that? Did you ask them? When did you ask them? What did they say? Right? So that claim does not answer that question on its own merits. We got to look at the declaration to get it, right? The purpose of the good behavior and lifetime clauses was to establish judges that were independent of the president. How do you know that? Did you ask who wrote them? What did they say? Oh, we did ask who wrote them in the records of the Federal Convention, right? So how do you know or why? Right? You ask yourself that question as you read. So whenever something looks important, ask yourself that question. And if it's a claim, look for the evidence or the details. If it's a claim, look for the detail that pairs to that claim. Right? That's a very important part of this reading process. Our next major interpretation, the reasons for these lifetime appointments may not apply anymore. Times change, old man, and I use the word man because our founding fathers were overwhelmingly men, right? We've got people ignoring their wives to do this stuff. Times change, old man. Our claim here that we're going to analyze. The founders acted at a time when experience with constitution making was limited to the recent experience of the colonies. They accepted judicial review of legislative and executive action as an abstract idea, but did not and could not know how its practice would evolve. This is on page 3, right? Our key evidence here is Marbury versus Madison is not until 1803. Marshall did not say the Supreme Court can check the actions of the executive or legislative branches until, on average, 20 years after these guys, 20 years after our two pieces of evidence from before, right? So what this is saying is, when we made the lifetime and good behavior clauses, we didn't even know what a Supreme Court justice is. We didn't even know what a Supreme Court justice is when we did that stuff, right? So that's a problem. We gave them this lifetime appointment, which in and of itself is a way to secure power, and we didn't even know what their job was yet, right? Judicial review of legislative action was outside the authority of British judges who had been given life tenure early in the 18th century. So when we're looking at the British judges to decide what a Supreme Court justice is, those British judges, they didn't have judicial review, at least not nearly as authoritative and dogmatic as the judicial. What that means is not as powerful. At the very least, not nearly as powerful as our modern Supreme Court justices, or even those Supreme Court justices that come after 1803, right? So we don't know what a Supreme Court justice is when we make these clauses. That's interpretation number 1. That's step 1. That's our first reason lifetime appointments may not apply anymore. I'm actually going to go ahead and add that to this slide. We didn't even know what a Supreme Court justice was yet. What I'm doing right now is what you should be doing as you're reading. We're developing our interpretations, we're identifying our claims, and we're pairing those claims with the relevant and most important details, right? We're going to move on from we didn't even know what a Supreme Court justice was yet, and we're going to move on to times change in terms of literal age. Since 1789, the average age of appointment in the court had been 53, with most appointees falling between 50 and 55. Until 1970, so that's over the course of 200 years, justices resigned or died at an average age of 68, thus serving an average tenure of about 15 years. A new justice joined the court about every 2 years. So a new justice joins the court about every 2 years. Keep that in mind. Since 1970, however, the average age of appointment has not changed. So our new Supreme Court justices after 1970 are still on average 55, 53, right? However, the length that they're in office has increased to almost 26 years as opposed to 15 years. They're in their jobs almost twice as long and will likely increase further without any changes as we get better at medicine and people live longer. No new appointment to the court occurred between 1994 and 2005. We went 11 years with exactly the same Supreme Court in office, right? So those people have way more power. They're in power for longer. They have control over the Supreme Court for 15 years, right? So our reasons for lifetime appointments may not apply anymore. There is stuff in the document that specifically suggests that Supreme Court justices were perfectly willing to retire and didn't envision themselves being Supreme Court justices for their entire lives. But then things have changed. And now Supreme Court justices are a little bit more stubborn and they tend to stick around for a little longer. And I want you to keep that in mind when you read the celebrity status and also the political contention parts of the document. Times change, old man. Judges are wild now. In each of the last 6 presidential elections, the identity of persons or types of persons the rival candidates might appoint to the court has been an important issue. I could speak on this on a very specific and personal level. I know that in the election of 2016, yes. So for the election of 2016, one of the major reasons that presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was so contentious was because early on in Donald Trump's presidency, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. There are 9 Supreme Court justices. He swung the scales of the Supreme Court wildly in the favor of the Republican Party because he nominated 3 Supreme Court justices out of 9 in the span of several years, right? And he nominated at least 2 of them were relatively young for the appointment. So those people are going to be around for a long time, and they're going to control what the Supreme Court does for a long time, right? So there's this new celebrity around politics. There's this issue of presidential elections in and of themselves. That's who they appoint to the Supreme Court kind of dictates how people vote for president. The founders, in providing for tenure during good behavior, did not contemplate that life tenure would accentuate the tendencies of justices to consider themselves as platonic guardians for American society. Remember, we don't have judicial review yet when we write that stuff. They don't have as prominent of a role to play in how Americans live their lives. In Federalist 78, we should know what the Federalist Papers are. Hamilton expressed views about the court that are quixotic in the light of contemporary reality. You probably saw that I had to Google what that word meant. I Google what words mean sometimes. Quixotic means idealistic to the point of arrogance or a negative consequence, right? What he means here in terms terms of expressed views about the court that are quixotic in the light of contemporary reality is that no matter how lofty the ideas of a Supreme Court justice are, they're not really going to have that much impact. The court, he stated, would be the least dangerous branch of the federal government. The court would be the least dangerous branch of the federal government. I want you to think about some of the issues that we've highlighted as being related to the power of the Supreme Court. Same-sex marriage, Miranda rights, desegregation of schools. I would ask you guys, do you agree with that sentiment? Right? Because it had neither the sword of the executive nor the person lawmaking powers of the legislature. A possible argument against that is, well, the Supreme Court can, by its very will, destroy the sword and completely control the lawmaking powers, right? This is an exaggeration, but in some specific cases, when it comes to some specific agendas and issues, it's not that far off. The federal judiciary, Hamilton famously said, has neither the force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. This is certainly not the case anymore. Even Donald Trump has occasionally expressed frustration over the Supreme Court that he himself has shaped a third of, and has shaped into a majority being on his side politically. The Supreme Court has certainly, in many cases across most of American history, expressed its own independent will from the president or Congress, right? But right now, the issue with this article is that okay in the context of these lifetime appointments? So we're dealing with the power of the judiciary, we're dealing with the power of the justices, but we're also dealing with that power combined with they serve for life, right? That's it for what I've got. I hope that will be helpful to you guys. I'm putting these slides on Google Classroom alongside this video, and think about the way that I put this stuff together in terms of how you should be fishing for stuff yourself, right? And I've put page numbers on most of these. I see now that I don't have page numbers on this stuff. I am almost 100% positive that these two passages come from page 7. So you'll be able to look at these slides and look at the document next to these slides and be able to see how I'm using the document and how I'm recording my stuff and how I'm pointing to things. Learn from this, right? Look for claims. Look for the evidence that supports those claims. And then ask yourself, why does that matter? Why does that claim being proved matter? And that's going to help you answer a lot of our questions, okay? Again, that's all I got. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.